Can I introduce this second plenary session? We have two speakers. I'll introduce each one at the time he's going to speak. Our first speaker is Arthur Waldron. Arthur Waldron is the Lauder Professor of International Relations in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. His specialities are the history of China and Eurasia and the history of war and violence. On these topics, Arthur has written 3 books in English, edited 4 more books, including 2 in Chinese. He is the co-editor of the Chinese Civil War volumes of Mao's Road to Power, and also co-editor of Volume 4 of the forthcoming Cambridge History of War. He is currently working on the Chinese volume for the Blackwell's Oxford series, Peoples of the World. In addition to these academic achievements and responsibilities, he is a regular consultant to government, I assume it means the US government, having served on the congressionally mandated US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, testifies regularly to both House and Senate committees. He's also served as an American representative in Track 2 meetings involving Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan and Russia, so he may be being called back to prevent an outbreak of nuclear war. And he's going to speak today on the topic of nationalism and revolution in China, the debate over how to fight the anti-Japanese war, 1937 to 1945.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. And let me first say how very grateful I and my wife are for the extraordinary hospitality that LSE has extended to us in the arrangements and every detail. It's just been quite wonderful compared to many academic jobs I've been on. Let me say by way of introduction that I was not long into my career as or it wasn't a career, but as a graduate student in Chinese history, reading book after book, that it began to strike me that the phrase rising nationalism was the universal explainer in Western literature about China. And I decided to look at nationalism. I did a little initial work. I published an article on nationalism long ago, but I decided, frankly, that the general question of nationalism was simply too hard. So I decided to focus on the case of China. But it is true that you will find rising nationalism in books about China, starting in the dealing with from the 1850s right up to the present. Although the phrase Chinese nationalism makes a sudden and rather abrupt appearance in the West for the first time in 1925, for reasons that I have tried to explain in a book that was published almost 20 years ago. I take an indirect approach, in other words, to nationalism. I look at a piece of evidence and try to see what it has to say. And today I'm going to talk about the tension between revolutionary ideas and nationalism in China's 8-year war of resistance against Japan. And it's known in Chinese as the War of Resistance against Japan in 8 years. And it struck me as I was coming over that, of course, in Russia, the resistance to Napoleon was the Fatherland War, and the resistance to Hitler was the Great Fatherland War. And I think that this is a significant difference, because one of the questions is whether the resistance is nationalistic in the sense that it has in mind some kind of a nation state that is to be realized, or whether the resistance is to a particular foe. And my focus this evening is the city of Wuhan. From June 11th to October 7th, 1938, one of the greatest battles of this 8-year war raged over what was then the second largest city. It's a vast inland metropolis, and by the time the battle was over, 250,000 Chinese were dead and 70,000 Japanese perished. And thereafter, the Chinese army slowly retreated up the Yangtze River, finally to Chongqing, beyond the Yangtze Gorges. Not a good place from which to fight the Japanese, but also a place from which to hurl defiance, because you could simply refuse to surrender. Now, on March 8th, 1938, the young Christopher Isherwood and his traveling companion, W.H. Auden, who were then on what they called a journey to a war, agreed, quote, "We would rather be in Wuhan at this moment than anywhere else on earth." Auden had already visited Spain in the Civil War, and he picked up Isherwood in Berlin, and then they set off to China. And the questions in the Spanish Civil War and the questions in China, at least in their minds, were quite similar. And they had to do with how important for victory was the social revolution and the social liberation of all classes. Was war a matter of equipment and divisions, or was it the case that an aroused populace could defeat a better armed enemy no matter what? And in this concept, we detect the influence of an idea which is traceable back to the French Revolution of the Levée en masse, August 1793, which basically transformed the French forces from being their usual scum and sweepings who could not be trusted to fight except under brutal discipline, which is what was characteristic of most European countries at that time, into the French revolutionary armies, which were animated by boldness, bravery, courage, and a reliability. You could send people off to do reconnaissance and they would come back. And the reason that this had worked, it was widely believed, was that the French Revolution had unleashed the powerful nationalism of the ordinary French citizen, which had previously been suppressed by the autocratic control of the monarchy. And in the 1930s, many people believed the same, that the defeat of fascism was going to be part war fighting and part revolution. And they applied this analysis to the Spanish Civil War. The great symbol, of course, was the parallel drawn between Madrid in Spain, which was untaken for a long time, and the attack on Wuhan, where there was a belief that if the same sorts of mobilizational tactics were used, it would be possible perhaps to hold the city indefinitely. Now, Franco, after he returned from Africa, initially attacked Madrid. And this attack either failed or was abandoned. And thereafter, he led his troops through Spain, fighting the Republican forces and liquidating tens of thousands of leftists suspected of real, while the capital Madrid stood unconquered. And some thought that it was unconquerable. As many of you know, some wags set up a fully set table and chairs in the Gran Via with a place card that said reserved for General Mola, Duke Mola, who was the commander of Franco's forces. And posters proclaimed, using a traditional name for the city, "The Bear of Madrid will destroy fascism." The lesson of the Spanish Civil War seemed to be that mobilized population using relatively simple weapons could defeat stronger and better armed conventional forces. And Madrid was not the only example. The Battle of Guadalajara in 1937 saw lightly armed guerrillas destroy Italian tank columns that were not unlike those the Japanese employed. And this seemed to confirm this idea. Well, as Auden and Isherwood arrived, a battle was taking shape that could be compared, in a way, to Madrid. In fact, they left before it began, and they were both safely in America by 1939. But the forces on both sides of this battle were, Chinese and Japanese, were conventional. The Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, and his German advisor, Alexander von Falkenhausen, were convinced that the only way to defeat the well-equipped Japanese was to have well-equipped Chinese. And it has to be recalled that the Japanese had weapons that in some cases were superior to anything that we had. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter, for instance, was better than its American or British counterparts. And for a long time, the only way to defeat it was complex dogfighting tactics. Now, the preponderance of thought in China was that John and his advisor were correct, that a modern, up-to-date, state-of-the-art Chinese army was what China needed. But there was division on the left about how to fight the war of resistance against Japan. Mao Zedong was much more of an internationalist and social revolutionary than is often recognized, and he opposed using his Red Army in head-to-head combat with the regular Japanese army. He preferred guerrilla operations, which tend to be morale builders and relatively low casualties. And he very much had his eye on a post-war showdown with Chiang Kai-shek. But his generals disagreed and wanted full participation in the war. And this brought them into conflict with Mao. And although this conflict hasn't been much studied, I've often wondered whether some of the very bitter personal attacks that took place during the Cultural Revolution did not go back to disagreements about the war against Japan. Well, the point to stress is that the idea of popular nationalism, revolutionary nationalism mobilized by the communists during the war, somehow peasant nationalism led in an almost linear fashion to their victory in the Civil War. This is a very influential idea for a good 50 years, since 1962, when Chalmers Johnson published Peasant Nationalism and Communist Power. Johnson has been thoroughly kicked around for this book. In fact, it's a rather good book, but one that reaches too far. Now, the war in China was unquestionably national, and in that sense, it was unlike the internal wars for power that had plagued China since the end of the Qing dynasty. But of course, the Spanish Civil War was also internal. And I was thinking to myself, who were the nationalists? Where was nationalism in the Spanish Civil War? I mean, you had the nationalists and the Republicans, arguably both patriotic, et cetera, et cetera. Autumn Isherwood had an interview with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and she was a very charming woman. She said to them, "We have told the communists, as long as you fight for China, we are all friends." And the two men had a not uncommon reaction, which was, no doubt, but what does she mean by China? Is this struggle to be a mere coolies' war, fought to make the country safe from the rule of the Song dynasty, the small and all-powerful clan of bankers, to which Madame Jiang herself belonged? Can Chiang Kai-shek, with his long record of communist suppression, ever form a permanent alliance with men like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, whose whole lives have been devoted to workers' struggles? It's certainly hard to believe. Well, Mao Zedong, in 1937, published an article called he had a series of lectures, gave an article on Protracted War. And he said, among other things in this, the interesting thing about unprotracted war is that there's no theory of victory. In other words, it never explains how the guerrillas in the end are going to defeat the conventional forces. But he does say, if a strenuous effort is made to secure all the necessary conditions, and by the necessary conditions he means the initiative and enthusiasm of the full people, disasters such as the loss of Nanjing and so forth they're going to be repeated unless we let the people rise up. And then he says China will have her Madrids, in places where those conditions, mass mobilization, are present. But so far, China has not had a Madrid. But from now on, we should work hard to create several. But it all depends on the conditions. The most fundamental of these is extensive political mobilization of the army and the people. Now, one of the most interesting foreign visitors to Wuhan during this period was the distinguished English author and political commentator Frida Utley, who is best known for her career in the United States after 1939, when she became very anti-communist. But she started out King's College London, and then she was a fellow at the London School of Economics until 1928. And in 1928, she joined the British Communist Party. At the time of the Battle of Wuhan, she was 40 years old, a tough and experienced traveler. And I just have to quote her description of how she packed. She got her portable typewriter, and then she got a single case into which she put a bottle of scotch, a carton of cigarettes, and a change of stockings. But she wrote a classic account of China at war, published by Faber and Faber. During this period, they published lots of stuff about these wars. She was there for much of the battle, and she utterly rejected Jiang's conventional approach, as she put it, to awaken the people to national consciousness and mobilize them to take an active part in winning the war means also awakening them to consciousness of their own grievances, to resentment of the privileges and material advantages of the bureaucracy, and the dangerous hatred of the landowners and usurers and employers who exploit them. The better spirits of the Kuomintang are not afraid of this, but the grafters, the rich, the lazy, and the inefficient fear the people perhaps more than the Japanese. And she summed this up by saying that the reason that Jiang was unwilling to unleash this putative latent force in China was, above all, because the more reactionary wing of the Kuomintang has power and the authorities are nervous of the people. We have to fight the war. We have to keep the social hierarchy intact. Now, Utley is referring here to a phenomenon of rural unrest. And just I have to say in passing that this idea that the Chinese countryside is constantly simmering with oppressed farmers wanting to overthrow landlords and so forth is, I think one can put a question mark there. If you do a close reading, for instance, of William Hinton's 3-volume trilogy on land reform, what you discover is that the communists judged the class consciousness of the person by whether they were willing to step forward in a struggle meeting and punch the landlord in the face. And they'd say, well, that person has developed class consciousness. After the communists took power, it turned out that a lot of these people simply liked to punch people in the face. As the Chinese delicately put it, to insult women. And the result was that lots of these people who are described in Volume 1 of Hinton, by Volume 3 have been given desk jobs far away from the people. One thing that was puzzling to Frida Utley and others was the fact that the communists in Wuhan didn't seem to pay much attention to the actual working masses there. No one seemed to be pressing demands on their behalf. But the fact that Madrid had resisted Franco's siege since November 36 gave heart to the nationalist defenders. And Zhou Enlai, who was the communist representative of the coalition government, took her on a walk around the lines and said, if the Wuhan cities could be held for a very long time, perhaps permanently, if the strategy of luring and outflanking the Japanese forces were adopted and advantage taken of the hills, defiles, and lakes. Well, let me just say a little bit about the communist side of this, because it's really quite complex. A war of national resistance in which the communists want to participate, but they don't want to risk their main forces. Mao wasn't really a nationalist, at least pure and simple. I mean, it's very hard to say he was a nationalist. But when he launched his disastrous Great Leap Forward in 1957, he distributed a number of utopian volumes from the Chinese tradition. And he also had a slogan called 3 No's. The 3 No's were no government, no country, no family. And somebody who believes in no government, no country, no family is probably not a true nationalist. Now, Mao's lack of conventional nationalism brought him into conflict with some of his closest colleagues who were simply outraged that the Japanese were on the soil of China. And this surfaced in 1937 at something called the Waldron Conference. Tony Seitz writes that there seemed to be some mild disagreements with Mao's views from military personnel such as Zhu De and Peng Dehuai. The interesting thing about Seitz's work is that he has a very thick book on the rise of the Communist Party, and I read it, and I noticed that he didn't use the word nationalism once in the entire book. So I ran into him and I asked him about this. He was surprised that I noticed it. And then he said it was an intentional omission because he did not think that nationalism was necessary to explain the rise of the communists. The bureaucratic and military politics were enough. The late Jürgen Gomez has a perhaps more substantial account of this meeting. Mao argued that during the war against the Japanese invaders, the CCP had in fact a second war to fight with the KMT. Hence, the party's military units should operate cautiously on the front line against the Japanese, relying mainly on guerrilla warfare and expanding their bases behind the enemy lines to conserve their strength for future anti-KMT struggles. Zhou Enlai, Peng Dehuai, Zhang Guotao, and most of the military leaders argued for all-out war effort against Japan, entirely unambiguous adherence to the United Front policies. And for the time being, Mao's opinions were not accepted until 1940 or so. The 8th Route Army, which was one of the 2 divisions out of roughly 200 Chinese divisions in the war, fought hard. Perhaps the best example of this conflict was the year July 1940, when Peng Dehuai, one of the great generals of the People's Republic, was given overall command of something called the 100 Regiments Offensive, in which 200,000 communist regulars and 200,000 guerrillas wreaked havoc on the Japanese logistical system. The Japanese struck back with great viciousness, which alienated a lot of people, and Peng was recalled to Yan'an, where he was not praised, but he was condemned for this military achievement, and he was called an empiricist, whatever that means, and Mao ordered that he should be criticized for 40 days for the failings of the campaign. He was not allowed to reply, and from 42 until 45, he stayed in Yan'an, and it's said that he supported Mao very closely. I can't help wondering how this sort of general took to being grounded in Yan'an at a time when the Japanese were basically go wherever they wanted in China. I think he must have been frustrated. He was criticized in the Cultural Revolution and died. His rehabilitation was signaled in 1992 when a history of the offensive was published with Deng Xiaoping's calligraphy on the cover. And in fact, the communist contribution to the war against Japan is actually quite small. I have at home the textbook that is used in the Chinese military academies, the political warfare textbook on the history of the PLA. It lists all the battles of the PLA. And the figure from 1937 to 1945 of battles is 9 battles that are listed. The Chinese communists themselves claim only 9 battles against the Japanese. Well, let me note that the parallels with Madrid were ultimately misleading. Madrid fell on March 26, 1939. Wuhan had already fallen in 1938, October 25th. And Franco had very little difficulty in taking the city. Just why this is a good question, but if you read Paul Preston's biography of Franco, which is, I think, a monument of scholarship, he argues that the Spanish insurgent leader, General Franco, probably could have taken Madrid earlier if he really put his mind on it and unified all his troops. But that he decided that it would be easier to rule Spain if he had already purified the population. So he traveled all around Spain, as I've said, killing and liquidating potential political enemies, and then at the very end of this, with Madrid isolated and the people cleansed, as it were, he took the city. Wuhan fell in 1938. Stephen McKinnon, who has written a wonderful book about the city during the war, there was a sort of artistic revival, there was a sort of super political nationalism or spirit of resistance. There were all sorts of interesting things about the time in Wuhan. He said that a Madrid effect could be felt in China, in which morale rose even after the fall of Wuhan. As he wrote, in the end, Wuhan did not escape the fate of the other major inland cities, and it was in ruins by the end of the war. But for a while, it was celebrated as a symbol of genuine resistance. Although after the communist triumph, there was an eclipse of the memory of this particular battle. And one of the things I've written about is the degree to which this eclipse of World War II and who actually fought and who actually didn't fight is now an issue in China. And if you go to the museum at the Marco Polo Bridge, there are exhibits about non-communist generals and heroes and all the rest. And there's a figure for how many tanks the communists destroyed in the war, and it's something like 6. You know, I wrote it down, you know, on a composite slip the way you do, knowing that you're never going to use it. And I doubt it might be 8. But it's a very small number of tanks destroyed, considering how long the war was. Well, what can this tell you, those of you who are students of nationalism and not of China? The first point I'd make is that in China, as in other countries, it's a mistake to imagine that some sort of latent unifying force is inherent in the people, waiting only to be awakened. The war unified the Chinese in opposition to a clear enemy, but in fact there were 3 different competing Chinese governments throughout the whole war. The Chinese political elite never really unified, even though the Japanese always had more divisions in China than they had in the rest of the theaters. And the idea of national awakening, which had figured very much in talk about China, turned out really not to be correct. People would fight the enemy, but there was no sense in which a vision of a new state emerged. There's a very good book on this by John Fitzgerald, Awakening China, Politics, Culture, and Class in the Nationalist Revolution. Furthermore, the Chinese population is very diverse. Many different dialects are spoken, identities are local, and a levée en masse in China might have unleashed pure chaos and regional conflict. The concept of revolutionary nationalism, the idea of revolution as somehow being a precondition for victory and for nationalism and for victory in war, does not work very well for China, particularly in the history of the communist period. Although it was a widespread belief among nearly everybody that Jiang was not fighting, and that if only the people could be unleashed, the Japanese would quickly be driven into the sea. Well, 250,000 dead at the Battle of Shanghai and 250,000 dead at the Battle of Wuhan. That's just 2 battles. That's more than the total membership of the Communist Party, plus 200 generals killed in the war, highest ranking Allied casualty, a Chinese general killed in the war, and really all the graduates of the Chinese military academies before the war. Those classes, it's like England in World War I, those classes just disappeared. Still, there's no question that something that we can call Chinese nationalism has existed, and exists today. And I would say that today, many of Chinese neighbors are beginning to feel its breath. But what I would note is that today's nationalism, such as the recent anti-Japanese demonstrations, is very much a from-the-top phenomenon. And it's turned off and on rather successfully and efficiently by the government. Furthermore, since the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, the Chinese government has sought consciously to foster nationalistic feeling among the population by so-called patriotic education, which is now a required subject in Chinese schools. And this is really a litany of all the ways in which China has been insulted and how bad the foreigners have been. But it was used, it was consciously, patriotism was consciously adopted as an antidote to the democratic ideas that had gotten loose in 1989. Now, what would happen if Chinese popular opinion were genuinely allowed to express itself? Well, I've talked to some people and they say that the popular nationalistic demand to attack Taiwan, to drop nuclear weapons on Japan, etc., would be irresistible. Others argue, and this is my argument, that local grievances, such as those of the foreigners, who are the perennial victims of Chinese politics, would come to the fore. You'd have a parliament full of people saying, we've got to have a school, we've got to have a hospital, we've got to have clean water, and so forth. But certainly what we have learned from this Chinese case, as from elsewhere, that even powerful, even a full invasion of your country by what Frieda Huntley calls the national and race enemy, does not necessarily lead to a unified and nationalistic response. And in fact, in the case of China, it led to a long debate about what was the best way to resist this attack. Well, that's what I have to say, and thank you very much.